also with the Cristo that's now in Central Park. When you say this is timely, it strikes me as this is he was a very extravagant, and he was a showman in some ways.
He was definitely, although in a kind of different way. You're right. That's a very interesting thing to think about, because I think Dalí himself, he definitely was a showman. I think to a degree he hid behind his big personality. I think in reality, from a lot that we know, we think he was quite shy. And really, in some ways, just, full of neuroses and nerves. And I think he covered that by having this larger-than-life personality, by doing absurd things, by shocking people. But at the same time, he feels things very deeply. And I think you see that in the exhibition. I mean, the Cristo is I think, a wonderful.
It's fun, I thought,
thing. Well, I think it's in a way, it does what all great art does, is it makes you think more about the park. I mean, I didn't have long enough to spend in it, but just walking through it the other day, and the sun was slanting along the park, and the little one of the gates would light up there, and then another would light up there.
And
you look deeper and deeper into the park. And
right.
I grew up in New York, and I know Central Park very well, but I saw it in a whole different way.
That was the intention.
No.
I'm sorry. You mentioned growing up in New York, and I do would like you to talk a little bit about your background, because I know your father was the director of the Museum of Modern Art, and I was just there. It's just reopened, and I noticed there was a room, the René Dardencourt room, obviously named after your father. Tell us what it was like growing up in, I guess, a museum family, but an avant-garde, must have been an avant-garde museum family, since it was the Museum of Modern Art, and at that time that was pretty modern. Now we're postmodern. It's still, but not in the same way as I think it was.
Then. Well, it may surprise you to hear this, but my father was not, in a way, a modernist at all. My father's his first passion was folk art and pre-Columbian art. He was he's complicated to explain. We could take our whole time and talk about him, which I know we don't want to do. But he came to the Modern about 1943 and became director 5 years or so later. And so I was an only child, and grew up with the feeling that museums were very natural places to be around. Never occurred to me that I would study art history or be a museum director. I had other plans. I was going to be a writer. I was going to be an actress. I was going to, God knows what. I studied history and literature. I did a lot with languages. And it wasn't that I didn't want to work in a museum. It just never occurred to me. And then at the end of my college years, all of a sudden I kind of looked around and said, something's missing. What is it that's missing? What's missing is art. And so I rushed off, and I went to London, and I got a degree in art history from the Courtauld Institute in London, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art was my first job.
So your whole career has been at the Philadelphia Museum.
I spent some time at the Art Institute of Chicago, which is where I met my husband, but for most part of it, I've been here.
Interesting. You talked about, as a child, you were surrounded by art. You always thought of museums as a natural place to be, and yet I don't think, unfortunately, that most people feel that way in our culture. I think one of the great things that the Philadelphia Museum of Art has done has been able to reach out to the community more than most museums. But what do you think about the museum's role in the community, and how does one bridge that problem of people being put off by the idea of a museum often as too highbrow or remote from the kind of thing that they're interested in?
Well, that's a very good question. I think, first of all, my experience with museums is get somebody into a museum, whatever age, whatever background, and walk with them to find something that catches their attention. And you don't need to do any work anymore because they suddenly see that something relates to them. I actually think that museums in general, maybe art museums in particular, but museums in general are very much au courant today. I mean, I think that there's much more interest in museums now, broadly speaking, and much more willingness to think that a museum will be a place where there'd be an interesting experience to be had, partly because museums are like a smorgasbord. I mean, it's not like a performance where you have to be there at 9 o'clock and you sit down and you have that and then that's done and then you go home. But it's like shopping in a mall or
interesting
sampling at a buffet.
Yeah,
you've got so
you
much.
Pick and choose as
if
you
you
please.
get into the Impressionist galleries and you're bored with Monet, well, there's a fantastic contemporary. There's Jasper Johns. Or if you'd like to go if you like a trip to the past, you can go and look at medieval stained glass. Or if you're interested in one aspect or another, we just had a wonderful exhibition of African art that went from great sort of historic tribal pieces to works of art and photographs made by African artists working today. And I think all of us go into any museum or any exhibition or any experience with preconceptions. And I think the best thing a museum can do is to sort of undermine those preconceptions in a variety of ways. Part of it is just what you have on view. I think a lot of people, there is a degree to which people feel that museums are only painting and sculpture. We're sitting in a gallery that sort of suggests something like that. Yeah. And that is a little intimidating for people because they feel it's more difficult to understand a painting. In fact, I don't think that's necessarily true, and I don't think they think it's necessarily true once they're there and doing it. But when people find out that there's arms and armor or Chinese furniture or crystal balls or there are all kinds of things, Indian sculpture, Tibetan deities. I mean, there's
you make it sound very enticing, I must say. You're a very good saleswoman for the museum. But don't you think museums themselves have taken a more aggressive role? I guess it's since the 1960s. Is it when Thomas Hoving was the director of the Metropolitan Museum? It seems to me that is often noted as a turning point when the museum felt it needed to market itself. What do you think of that? I mean, do you think that's true? And the notion of the blockbuster exhibit, which in a way the Dalí exhibit certainly is, if you're ever going to call anything a blockbuster exhibit, that's
that
it.
Is.
What do you think of this trend, in a sense?
Well, first of all, you have to I'm one of those people, and I sort of model myself on a wonderful man who's a professor of history at University of Chicago, called Neil Harris, who every time you say, well, we've just done this, and he'll say, well, the last time your museum did that was in 1935. And he's always right. Yeah. And I think we forget. The museum was born out of a blockbuster. The World's Fair in 1876 in Philadelphia, there were 10 million people came to Philadelphia to see that show over 6 months. I mean, and how the population of the United States at that time was something like 40 million. I mean, that is amazing. Yeah. This is totally amazing. And
there's always been, I don't want to use the word, I don't use the word in a denigrating way, but there's always been a kind of circus aspect then to the museum.
Sure. Yeah. And in fact, this very same Neil Harris has written a book about P.T. Barnum. He's very good at writing. I think museums have always sought to do a mixture of enticing, entertaining, educating, in a way carrying people away. I mean, I think that you can do time travel, mental travel, spiritual travel, sexy travel by going to a museum. You can let your mind go. Yeah. And I think museums have certainly become much more sophisticated, and we have more tools at our command, or as to how to communicate with people and about what they see or what they might see. I mean, the internet is an incredible tool. You can over time, we'll have the opportunity to tell people what they will see, to offer them a chance to create their own tours, you know, to give people information before they come to the museum, to reach kids very young. I mean, it used to be, I think what's changed is not so much the intent, which is to educate and to welcome and to bring people in and to show them that museums are not intimidating, difficult places. They're actually places where you can learn a lot and have a lot of fun at the same time, and where you can go with 3 or 4 friends and you can communicate with your friends while you're doing it, which is half the fun. Right. Whereas if you go to I love the performing arts. But if you go there, you better be quiet and listen.
That's a really good point. That's a great marketing point, I think. To speak it.
Well, I don't try to run down.
No, but I just realized you can't go to a movie and talk during the movie. Go to the art museum.
You get in
stand
trouble.
in front of the picture and you talk, so you interact with your date or whatever, and you also have the experience of the art, I think. By the way, I wanted to ask you before we end this interview whether you had a chance to look through the paintings here. This is the Westfall Picture Gallery. Drexel's very proud of this gallery, and I wondered if anything struck your eye.
Well, I was actually very struck not only by some of the very grand portraits, but also some of the landscape. There's a wonderful painting by Adolf Schreier of Arab horsemen in a landscape by a pool that is just very alive, and he's a wonderful artist, and it seems to me a grand example of his work. But I think we've all learned a lot about how people want to learn, and giving them choices. If they want to listen to an audio tour, great. If they want to have a real person talking about art, great. If they want to just be by themselves and stroll through the gallery, that's really important, because we get bombarded by so much stuff now. Yeah. You know, I will never forget being so moved by a visitor. I think he was a truant officer at a school some time ago who just said, I go to the museum just to be myself and to connect with myself and to just let my mind go. And he didn't mean let his mind go to pieces. He meant let his mind go and range around what he was looking at. I think we've actually just had part of what museums need to do. And you talked about marketing, and I didn't take you up on Tom Hoving because he's a famous marketer, but I think there have been marketers before and since. He certainly, however, he certainly got a lot of visibility for himself and for the Met. By doing what he did. But we just had the great good fortune of having a little half-hour film about the museum, supported by our board chairman, Jerry Lenfest, which was we'd never had a film for television that ran on, and it was actually a partnership with Comcast, so they showed it at lots of different times and not at 2 in the morning. Although there's some night owls who were getting something good out of it too, I'm sure. But it really introduced the museum to people who'd never been there, and had actually interviewed a lot of visitors who talked about their first impressions and what surprised them. Yeah. And I think what just surprised them was that a museum like a city, and museums and cities have a lot in common. It's a whole universe. Yeah. You know,
yes, and I'm going to have to stop you here, but you've done a wonderful job. I think we should all run out now and go to the museum. Actually, I will say the Dalí exhibit is quite, it's mind-blowing, if you'll excuse my using that term for it. It's an extraordinary exhibit. And I want to thank you for being here today.
Well, it was my great pleasure.
I hope you'll come again.
We'd love to.
And thank you for joining us today for the Drexel interview.